Per parte 9, dai che voglio arrivare alla parte in cui incontra Megan, che sono sicuro che da quel momento in poi diventa più avvincente. Per quanto riguarda i sottotitoli, nel video che vediamo insieme, io i sottotitoli in italiano non li posso attivare. Però voi potete attivare i sottotitoli in italiano in questo video che state vedendo, questo mio, questo prodotto da me. Perché per fortuna YouTube produce sottotitoli automatici, quindi anche se io non posso attivare i sottotitoli in italiano, voi lo potete benissimo fare. Dici come lo facciamo? È semplicissimo. Ve lo spiego, basta che andate qui nel mio video e poi mettete e poi selezionate sottotitoli, traduzione automatica, selezionate italiano. Selezionati!
Murmured apologies.
No,
Every
stai
time I
zitto,
tried to
zitto
picture
che
the
non abbiamo
scene,
ancora
it reminded
iniziato. Selezionate italiano. In questo modo, in questo video che voi vedrete, che state vedendo adesso, vedrete automaticamente i sottotitoli in italiano apparire come per magia nel mio video. Per quanto riguarda la grandezza dei sottotitoli, io non sono responsabile di questo, dovete lamentarvi direttamente con YouTube, non potete lamentarvi di tutte cose con me. Detto questo, iniziamo subito.
me of a thwarted pickpocketing or a rugby tap tackle. I wondered, watching Granny rock out to Brian May, if Pay ever tried? Probably not. When he was 5 or 6, Granny left him, went off on a royal tour lasting several months, and when she returned, she offered him a firm handshake, which may have been more than he ever got from Grandpa. Indeed, Grandpa was so aloof, so busy traveling and working, he barely saw Pa for the first several years of his life. As the concert went on and on, I began to feel tired. I had a headache from the loud music and from the stress of the last few weeks. Granny, however, showed no signs of fading. Still going strong, still tapping and swaying. Suddenly, I looked closer. I noticed something in her ears. Something gold? Gold as the golden carriage. Gold as the golden angels. I leaned forward. Maybe not quite gold. No, maybe it was more yellow. Yes, yellow earplugs. I looked into my lap and smiled. When I lifted my head again, I watched with glee as Granny kept time to music she couldn't hear, or music she'd found a clever and subtle way of distancing, controlling. More than ever before, I wanted to give my Granny a hug. I sat down with Pa that summer, possibly at Balmoral, though it might have been Clarence's house, where he was now living more or less full-time. He'd moved in shortly after Gangan's death, and wherever he lived, I lived. When I wasn't living at Manor House, my final year at Eton drawing near, Pay wanted to chat about how I envisaged my life post-Eton. Most of my mates would be headed off to university. Willie was already at St. Andrews and thriving. Hennes had just finished his A-levels at Harrow School and was planning to go to Newcastle. And you, darling boy, have you given any thought to the future? Why, yes. Yes, I had.
Quando spunta Megan.
For several years I'd talked in all seriousness about working at the ski resort in Lech am Arlberg, where money used to take us. Such wonderful memories. Specifically, I wanted to work at the fondue hut in the center of town, which Mummy loved. That fondue could change your life. I really was that mad. But now I told Pa I'd given up the fondue fantasy, and he sighed with relief. Instead, I was taken with notions of becoming a ski instructor.
Ma ce lo vedete Harry a vendere il formaggio? Questo è veramente segno del fatto, conferma di quello che dicevo prima, che non ha proprio capito lui di far parte della famiglia reale. Lui pensa tipo di avere semplicemente privilegi. Gli avranno detto tu hai dei privilegi, sei privilegiato tipo quando era piccolo. E lui è rimasto questa cosa, ma non è che ha capito cosa vuol dire diciamo, l'apparenza, il rigore, l'eleganza, la salute mentale. Zero, proprio. Disfunzione assoluta.
Pat tensed again. Out of the question. Oak. Long pause. How about safari guide? No, darling boy. This wasn't going to be easy. Part of me really did want to do something totally outside the box.
Mi immagino la frustrazione. Faccio così o lascio così? Mi immagino la frustrazione di Re Carlo, allora principe, ad avere a che fare con sto beota che gli dice voglio vendere le fondue, voglio fare l'istruttore di sci, di safari, ma quello che aveva capito di essere figlio del re, della regina, perché giustamente, no? Figlio di reali, perché giustamente lo trattavano come reale. Ma perché Harry è venuto così? Non si capisce, è una variante impazzita. Poverino, mischino, perché alla fine secondo me lui a sentirsi, cioè si sente incompreso. Il problema è che, cioè, vivi in un mondo parallelo completamente, figlio mio.
Something that would make everyone in the family, in the country, sit up and say, "What the?" Part of me wanted to drop out, disappear, as Mummy did. And other princes. Wasn't there one in India, a long time ago? A bloke who just walked out of the palace and sat under a lovely banyan tree. We'd read about him at school, or we were supposed to. But another part of me felt hugely ambitious. People assumed that the spare wouldn't or shouldn't have any ambition. People assumed that royals generally had no career desires or anxieties.
Ma ambizioni, figlio mio, cioè se tu mi dici voglio fare il CEO di Google, allora quella la posso chiamare un'ambizione. Ma se mi parli di safari e di vendere formaggi, tesoro mio, cioè onestamente, ma che ambizioni ha? Che ambizioni sono? Con tutto il rispetto per chi fa questi lavori, però parliamo di un principe. È ovvio che, per esempio, guardate la regina d'Olanda, Maxima. Lei lavora, se non sbaglio, come... lavora per l'ONU, se non sbaglio, fa comunque sia qualcosa che ha a che fare con delle associazioni umanitarie. Tutte le regine sono in un certo senso coinvolte in attività umanitarie. Poi, veramente? Cambiare, vendere il formaggio?
You're royal.
Poi se le tue ambizioni sono così basse, grazie al cazzo che vai a finire con una moglie che ti maltratta. Avrebbero dovuto... Gli avrebbero dovuto fare un training a questo principe. Un training per il cervello.
Everything's done for you, why worry? But in fact, I worried quite a lot about making my own way, finding my purpose in this world.
Ma fatti consigli.
I didn't want to be one of those cocktail slurping, eye-roll-causing sloths everyone avoided at family gatherings. There had been plenty of those in my family, going back centuries. Pa, in fact, might have become one. He'd always been discouraged from hard work, he told me. He'd been advised that the heir shouldn't do too much, shouldn't try too hard, for fear of outshining the monarch. But he'd rebelled, listened to his inner voice, discovered work that excited him. He wanted that for me. That was why he didn't press me to go to university. He knew it wasn't in my DNA. Not that I was anti-university per se. In fact, the University of Bristol looked interesting. I'd pored over its literature, even considered a course in art history. Lots of pretty girls took that subject. But I just couldn't picture myself spending years bent over a book. My Eton housemaster couldn't either. He told me straight out, "You're not the university type, Harry." Now Pei added his assent. It was no secret, he said gently, that I wasn't the family scholar. He didn't mean it as a dig. Still, I winced. He and I went round and round, and in my head I went back and forth, and by a process of elimination we landed on the army. It made sense. It aligned with my desire to be outside the box, to disappear. The military would take me away from the prying eyes of the public and the press. But it also fitted with my hope of making a difference. and it accorded with my personality. My prized toys as a boy had always been miniature soldiers. I'd spent thousands of hours planning and waging epic battles with them at Kensington Palace and in Highgrove's Rosemary Very-designed gardens. I'd also treated every game of paintball as though the future of the Commonwealth depended on the outcome. Per smiled. Yes, darling boy. The army sounds like just the thing. But first, he added, many people took a gap year as a matter of course. Pa, however, considered a gap year to be one of the most formative periods in a person's life. See the world, darling boy. Have adventures. So I sat down with Marco and tried to decide what those adventures might look like. We settled first on Australia. Spent half the year working on a farm. Excellent. As for the second half of the year, Africa, I told Marco I'd like to join the fight against AIDS. That this would be an homage to Mummy. An explicit continuation of her work didn't need to be spelled out. Marco went away, did some research, came back to me and said, Lesotho. Never heard of it, I confessed. He educated me. Landlocked country. Lovely country. Bordering South Africa. Lots of need. Loads of work to be done. I was overjoyed. A plan. At last. Soon after, I visited Henna's. A weekend in Edinburgh. Autumn 2002. We went to a restaurant and I told him all about it. Good for you, Haz. He was taking a gap year as well, in East Africa. Uganda, as I recall. Working in a rural school. At the moment, however, he was working a part-time job at Ludgrove, working as a stooge. The Ludgrovian word for handyman. It was a very cool job, he said. He got to be with kids, got to fix things all over the grounds. Plus, I teased him. All the free strawberries and carrots you can eat. But he was quite serious about it. I like teaching, Haz. Oh, we talked excitedly about Africa, made plans to meet up there. After Uganda, after college, Henna's too would probably go into the army. He was going to be a green jacket. It wasn't really a decision. His family had been in uniform for generations. We talked about meeting up there too. Maybe, we said, we'll find ourselves side by side one day, marching into battle or helping people on the other side of the world. The future. We wondered aloud what it held. I worried about it, but not Henna's. He didn't take the future seriously, didn't take anything seriously. Life as it comes has. That was Henna's, always and forever. I envied his tranquility. For now, however, he was heading to one of Edinburgh's casinos. He asked if I wanted to come along. Ah, can't, I said. I couldn't possibly be seen in a casino. It would cause a huge scandal. Too bad, he said. Cheers, we both said, promising to talk again soon. 2 months later, a Sunday morning, just before Christmas 2002. The news must have come in the form of a phone call, though I only dimly recall holding the phone, hearing the words. Henna's and another boy, leaving a party near Ludgrove, drove into a tree. Though the call's a blur, I vividly remember my reaction. Same as when Per told me about Mummy. Right? So Henna's was in an accident. But he's in hospital, right? He's going to be okay. No, he wasn't. And the other boy, the driver, had been critically injured. Willie and I went to the funeral. A little parish church down the road from where Henna's grew up. I remember hundreds of people squeezing into creaky wooden pews. I remember, after the service, queuing up to hug Henna's parents, Alex and Claire, and his brothers, Thomas and Charlie. I think, while we waited, I overheard whispered discussions of the crash. It was foggy, you know. They weren't going far. But where were they going? And at that time of night, they were at a party and the sound system was knackered. So they ran off to get another. No. They went to borrow a CD player from a friend. Short distance, you know. So they didn't bother with seatbelts. Just like Mummy. And yet, unlike Mummy, there was no way to spin this as a disappearance. This was death, no two ways about it. Also, unlike Mummy, Henna's wasn't going that fast. Because he wasn't being chased. 20 miles an hour, tops, everyone said. And yet the car went straight into an old tree. Old ones, someone explained, are much harder than young ones. They wouldn't let me out of Eton until I acted. That was what they said. I needed to take part in one of their formal dramas before they'd punch my ticket and release me into the wild. It sounded ridiculous, but theatre was deadly serious at Eton. The drama department staged several productions each year, and the year-end production was always the most major of them all. In the late spring of 2003, it was Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing. I was cast as Conrad, minor character. He was, perhaps, a drinker, perhaps a drunkard, which gave the press all sorts of clever openings for calling me a drunkard too. What's this? Bit of typecasting, is it? Stories wrote themselves. Eton's drama teacher said nothing about typecasting when he gave me the role. He just told me I was Conrad. Have fun with it, Harry, and I didn't question his motives. I wouldn't have questioned them even if I'd suspected he was taking the piss, because I wanted to get out of Eton, and to get out of Eton you had to act. Among other things, I learned from studying the play that it was wrong-headed and reductive to focus on Conrad's alcohol consumption. He was a fascinating guy, really. Loyal but also immoral. Full of advice, but essentially a follower. Above all, he was a henchman, a sidekick, whose main function, seemingly, was to give the audience a laugh or two. I found it easy to throw myself into such a role, and discovered during dress rehearsals that I had a hidden talent. Being royal, it turned out, wasn't all that far from being on stage. Acting was acting, no matter the context. Opening night, my father sat dead center in a packed Farrar theatre, and no one had a better time. Here it was, his dream come true, a son performing Shakespeare, and he was getting his money's worth. He roared, he howled, he applauded, but, inexplicably, at all the wrong moments. His timing was bizarrely off. He sat mute when everyone else was laughing. He laughed when everyone else was silent. More than noticeable, it was bloody distracting. The audience thought Per was a plant, part of the performance. Who's that over there, laughing at nothing? Oh, is that the Prince of Wales? Later, backstage, Per was all compliments. You were wonderful, darling boy. But I...
Mi chiedo cosa vorrà, diciamo, insinuare con questa cosa che il principe Carlo rideva quando gli altri stavano in silenzio e stava in silenzio quando tutti gli altri ridevano. Forse che il principe Carlo, in quanto attore di tragedie shakespeariane, capiva differentemente da tutto il resto del pubblico il vero senso dell'ironia o di quello che c'è da capire delle tragedie shakespeariane, per questo era asincrono rispetto agli altri, o forse vorrà dire che Principe Carlo era cretino? È certo che è strana questa cosa.
I couldn't help looking cross. What's the matter, darling boy? Pa, you laughed at all the wrong times. He was baffled. I was too. How could he have no idea what I was talking about? Slowly it became clear. He told me once that, when he was my age, acting in his own school performance of Shakespeare, Grandpa turned up and did exactly the same thing. Laughed at all the wrong times. Made a complete spectacle. Was Pa modeling his own father? Because he knew no other way to parent? Or was it more subliminal? Some recessive gene expressing itself? Is each generation doomed to unwittingly repeat the sins?
Che cosa tossica. Cioè, suo padre non sa come fare da padre, quindi imita suo padre, che comunque sia, diciamo, non è stato un padre presente. E certo sono tanto disfunzionali comunque sia, mamma mia. Stanno male, vedete? I soldi non sono tutto. E neanche i titoli. Ci vuole la salute mentale. Voi pensate uno che è povero e non ha salute mentale, come dovrebbe stare? Mamma mia.
Of the last? I wanted to know, and I might have asked. But that wasn't the sort of thing you could ever raise with Pay or Grandpa. So I put it out of my mind and tried to focus on the good. Pat is here, I told myself, and he's proud, and that's not nothing. That was more than a lot of kids had. I thanked him for coming, gave him a kiss on each cheek. As Conrad says, can you make no use of your discontent? I completed my education at Eton in June 2003, thanks to hours of hard work and some extra tutoring arranged by Per. No small feat for one so unscholarly, so limited, so distracted. And while I wasn't proud of myself exactly, because I didn't know how to be proud of myself, I felt a distinct pause in my non-stop internal self-criticism. And then I was accused of cheating. An art teacher came forward with evidence of cheating, which turned out not to be evidence of cheating. It turned out to be nothing at all, and I was later cleared by the exam board. But the damage was done. The accusation stuck. Broken-hearted, I wanted to release a statement, hold a press conference, tell the world. I did the work. I didn't cheat. The palace wouldn't let me. In this, as in most things, the palace stuck fast to the family motto. Never complain, never explain. Especially if the complainer was an 18-year-old boy. Thus I was forced to sit by and say nothing while the papers called me a cheat and a dummy every day. Because of an art project. I mean, how do you cheat on an art project? This was the official start of that dreaded title, Prince Thicko. Just as I was cast as Conrad without my consultation or consent, I was now cast in this role. The difference was, we did much ado about nothing for 3 nights. This had the look of a role that would last a lifetime. Prince Harry? Oh yeah, not too bright. Can't pass a simple test without cheating, that's what I read. I talked to Per about it. I was near despair. He said what he always said. Darling boy, just don't read it. He never read it. He read everything else, from Shakespeare to white papers on climate change, but never the news. He did watch the BBC, but he'd often end up throwing the controller at the TV. The problem was, everyone else read it. Everyone in my family claimed not to, just like Per. But even as they were making this claim to your face, liveried footmen were bustling around them, fanning every British newspaper across silver platters, as neatly as the scones and marmalades. The farm was called Tulumbilla. The people who owned it were the Hills. Noel and Annie. They'd been friends of Mummy. Annie had been Mummy's flatmate when she first started dating Per. Marco helped me find them, and somehow persuaded them to let me be their unpaid summer jackaroo. The Hills had 3 children, Nicky, Lucy, and George. The eldest, George, was exactly my age, though he looked much older, perhaps due to years and years of toil under the boiling Australian sun. Upon arriving, I learned that George would be my mentor, my boss, my headmaster, in a way, though Toowoombbilla was nothing like Eton. In fact, it was like no place I'd ever been. I came from a green place. The Hills farm was an ode to Brown. I came from a place where every move was monitored, catalogued, and subjected to judgment. The Hills farm was so vast and remote that no one would see me for most of each day but George, and the odd wallaby. Above all, I came from a place that was temperate, rainy, cool. The Hills farm was hot. I wasn't sure I could endure this kind of hot. The Australian outback had a climate I didn't understand and which my body couldn't seem to accept. Like Pa, I wilted at the mere mention of heat. How was I supposed to put up with an oven inside a blast furnace inside a nuclear reactor set on top of an active volcano? Bad spot for me, but worse for my bodyguards. Those poor lads, of all the assignments. Plus, their lodging was extra Spartan, an outbuilding on the edge of the farm. I rarely saw them and often imagined them out there, sitting in their briefs before a noisy electric fan, grumpily polishing their CVs. The Hills let me bunk with them in the main house, a sweet little bungalow with white clapboard, wooden steps leading to a wide porch, a front door that gave out a kittenish squeak every time you pulled it open, and a loud bang every time you let it fly shut. The door had a tight screen to keep out mosquitoes, which were big as birds. That first night, sitting over dinner, I couldn't hear anything but the rhythmic slap of bloodsuckers against mesh. There wasn't much else to hear. We were all a bit awkward, trying to pretend that I was a jackaroo, not a prince, trying to pretend that we weren't thinking about Mummy, who'd loved Annie, and whom Annie had loved in turn. Annie clearly wanted to talk about Mummy, but as with Willie, I just couldn't. So I shoveled in the food, and praised it, and asked for seconds, and searched my brain for anodyne topics of conversation. But I couldn't think of any. The heat had already impaired my cognitive skills. Falling asleep those first nights in the outback, I'd conjure up the image of Marco and worriedly ask him, "Did we really think this through, mate?" The remedy to all problems, as always, was work. Hard, sweaty, non-stop labor, that was what the Hills had to offer, and plenty of it, and I couldn't get enough.